WNS at Howard Bank at howardbank.com. Make sure you're checking them out. They got locations all over town now, a relentless commitment to being the best at everything they do. They also sponsor our Be More Positive series, also brought to you by our friends at Cole Roofing, where I keep my Kona Blend mug and my Kona Blend coffee in my Cole Roofing mug from Royal Farms. Cole Roofing's also sponsoring our Be More Positive series on Thursdays as well. This week, we're going to be doing some cool stuff around here. We're going to Tampa for some hockey. We're into this Joe Flacco, Lamar Jackson thing, and we'll be talking more about that. But the Orioles have come home yet again at 8-20, whatever they are, and in other organizations, they fire people for this sort of thing. But not around here. This guy remembers the old Oriole way and Oriole magic, and as I bring him on with the dulcet tones of something magic happens, he is the sports professor of all goodness down at Georgetown University after a long, long stint running the business of the Orioles back in the 80s and early 90s as they moved from the Fantastic Fans Night to where we are now. We welcome Marty Conway back. You can follow him out on LinkedIn, out on Twitter. He's one of our fantastic guests here who plays the inside pool and helped build the legend of Oriole baseball. Well, Marty, you and I have been at this a long time. We've turned another corner here where they've crushed the season before Kentucky Derby weekend, and now they're the remnants of this, and we get to see just how dysfunctional this place is amidst all this now, don't we?
Yeah, it's been a long time since as you said, they've been out of it by the time the Preakness even ran in Baltimore. So, it was about that 30-year mark. But yes, that kind of pressure, that kind of, the reality of it puts pressure on the organization. And typically, again, we're not talking about typical organization here. On a road trip that comes back with an OFA road trip, and you come back and you're, worst team in baseball or tied for the worst team in baseball, the off day is when you typically would see something, and it doesn't look like anything's going to transpire in that regard. There isn't going to be any changes to the coaching staff. There isn't going to be any sort of other changes to indicate, what they would like to do.
Well, what do they call that? Moving lawn chairs on the Titanic, right? Kind of.
Well, I just think it's an like I said, no activity is an indication that there just isn't the typical function that you would look at and somebody would say, we need to do something here. We are, 10-15% of our season in, almost 20% of our season in, and what are we going to do here to salvage the remaining 70 or 80%? Even if you don't think that ultimately you'll contend for the playoffs, you still have 100 and some games to play that mean something, and it means for your franchise and your organization for the future. Even if you begin to allow more stories to float publicly about what you might do, you have to do something. Doing nothing is just not an option.
They own a media network, and they don't even float ideas, do they? Right? I mean, literally, they can't even float rumors through their own people, and none of their people have any credibility, like that goof sitting out in front of the warehouse talking about how tough the schedule was. Like, It's revolting. It's shocking. It's deplorable. It's almost like our government at this point, quite frankly.
Well, when we're together, I use the term all the time, unorthodox, right? And that's another way to...
I used that earlier today. I couldn't think of the word. I kept saying not normal, and it took me 10 minutes, and I was talking to Luke, and I'm like, unorthodox. That's what he calls it. And you've already cracked me up by saying, well, this is not, a normal, typical, or... we try to mince words as to what this is without calling it an S show, but... consumer confidence is not something that they've ever bothered with there in 25 years, right?
No, it's like putting your shoes on the wrong feet. At some point you realize, oh my gosh, my feet hurt, and you look down and you say, my shoes are actually on the wrong feet. I can wear them that way, and I can get through the day, but it's going to be pretty painful, and I think that's sort of what they have here is their shoes are on the wrong feet organizationally, but they just continue to sort of go on through the day. Yeah, what really happens here, how this typically plays out for organizations, whether in the NBA or Major League Baseball that have these kind of issues early on, it impacts the frequency of the frequency of fans attending games. Baltimore, whether it's for the Orioles or for the Ravens, there is there is a crust level of fan support that typically they're not going to go below. That number for baseball is around 1.7.5 million people. And it looks like they'll probably fall now to that 1.8 to 2 million, announced fans. But what happens is when you get off to a start like this, the frequency of people attending, people that might have come to 2 or 3 games now come to 1. People that would have come to 4 or 5 games come to 2 or 3. They don't reach for that additional game or two that they thought about. That money now goes to other activities. It goes into a 3-day weekend vacation. It goes into maybe a trip to see baseball someplace else, maybe on the road somewhere, maybe to the Washington Nationals, maybe something for the All-Star Game, Fan Fest, you name it. They do that. So that's what happens. And if you're running the organization early in the season, that's what you're trying to counteract. You want to do some things now in the second half of your season that would spur people to change their mind again and make a decision to come to the ballpark in July, August, or maybe even September. As difficult as that is, whatever strategy and plan they had going into the season, that has to get blown up, and now they have to have a new promotional plan, frankly, for the rest of the season to salvage what they can.
He is Marty Conway. He's out on LinkedIn, on Twitter. He's down at Georgetown doing all things sports, business, and professoring, but certainly ran baseball teams, ran the Orioles for a long time, as well as the Texas Rangers, and then moved on into the real world and out of the toy department. But let's say they call an old codger like you for some new tricks, and what's this going to take, Marty? And I don't mean with John and Mama Angelos, but do you have any crystal ball for 5 years from now of what a different owner here could look like in hiring someone like you, or giving a call to someone, who sat in your chair, or Dennis Mannion, who used to do this for the, who's now sitting it out in New Hampshire, and some guy who used to do this, or some guy who's done it in the NBA, that's going to come in here and sort of run the operation, the business side of this, let alone the baseball side, which the fans are all caught up in, who's going to manage the team, and who's going to pick the players, and where are we with Brady Anderson. The whole thing top down from how they sell tickets and how they run the business is flawed when it comes to this, because no one has a plan for 8-26, right? I mean, there is no plan for that.
But, that's right. You don't, like I said, you don't have a plan for that. You have to improvise as you go, and it puts you more in the reacting for the rest of the season, trying to react to current events, trying to react to things that happen that you can capitalize and take advantage of, because there is no great story to go out and tell. But frankly, it's even difficult rebuilding story to tell unless you really have, like the Atlanta Braves and a couple of other teams who had players that the entire organization, the city, and Major League Baseball was watching and waiting to be called up. I go back to when the Braves, when the Cubs had Chris Bryant and other players like that, right? There was a lot of anticipation and speculation. The Orioles don't have that. They don't have the 1 or 2 or 3 prospects that everybody is waiting to see. So you have to be improvising. But back to your original question, I've said this before and continue to say again, the success of the Orioles over time has always been about the relationships and partnerships and deals that have been done in the community. And that's where it has to start. You're not going to be able to generate this on your own. You could bring in the best inside person, the best analytics person, all of that. But ultimately, it's going to take a broad local marketing effort that has a lot of, substance to it. Somebody that has, or more than one person that has a lot of strong community ties. Like I said, I think the Orioles have done a very nice job of their philanthropy. I think they are committed to doing things like that, and they do that consistently well. But the rest of the relationship building at the top to top CEOs, the COOs, people like that, it is pretty much all but watered away. And that's just a combination of when Peter was active in running the organization and John was not involved. That's not what Peter or any of his folks were going to do. From time to time, they had Joe Foss, they had some other people in that role, but ultimately every time they had someone in that role, they were sort of ushered out in one way, shape, or form. That's really what Major League Baseball teams need, is a commitment at the top to go throughout the community from northwest to southeast to northeast, all those places, and get into rooms and get into conference rooms and get into buildings and COO and president's office and get small businesses and other people back engaged at the ballpark, buying, as I've said before, buying ticket packages, but committing to the future. And then from there, that's the base layer, and the rest of it in terms of groups and promotional days and everything else builds that pyramid to the point where you can consistently draw 25, 30, 35,000 a night. And I think that's possible in this market. I don't think the market for baseball in Baltimore has gone away in any way, shape, or form, but I just think it goes into stages of dormancy, and that's what it takes. They had some winning for a while that sort of resurged that, but it didn't last long enough because they didn't really react to it and build the strength of commitment.
They didn't do a good job when they were winning, right? They waited 20 years to win, and they even screwed that up, like literally, right?
Well, the point that I was continuing to make there was that they didn't build in the hooks and the roots into the ground of those relationships. So that's why you saw from 2016 to now they've lost 400,000 in attendance, even though for a year and a half of that period they were generally competitive. And that's a pretty good indication that they didn't spread it wide enough and really build consistency so that it's all about repeat buying. It's all about committing in the off season. It's all about doing those sorts of things that the Ravens have done for years and years and years. And we'll get into this, I'm sure, in a minute. But, the equation and the balance that the Ravens looked at was, hey, this could be going away. And so they made that kind of move. And it's interesting to watch the two organizations sort of go back and forth on opportunity and strategy, because sometimes they've juxtaposed each other, where the Orioles have, had the opportunity, didn't really take advantage of it. And then there's other times where the Ravens had opportunities and also didn't really take advantage of it from a business standpoint.
Marty Conway joining us here, professor of sports business at Georgetown. You can follow him on LinkedIn as well, as he's been particularly chippy on Twitter lately on local issues and business issues. And you mentioned the Ravens and how they play into this. That is a big part of this, right? I mean, it's and certainly the Caps, as I'm wearing my Caps hat, my Courage hat all week here, as they continue to play for another week or 10 days. At least they bought themselves that with the Game 6 win on Monday night, Marty. But there are other things to concentrate on, and the Preakness coming next week, and Bob Baffert coming in with his super horse that won in the slop last week in Kentucky. Boy, in lacrosse, I mean, there's just a lot going on that doesn't include the Kansas City Royals, the Tampa Rays, or who do we play? Oh, the Philadelphia Phillies next week. I'm sure they'll be packing them in and bringing them down the freeway next week as well. They're over 500 and have turned it around, as is Tampa. They haven't been as awful as we thought, but the next 10 days, this is what they've come home to. And yet the status quo is not selling tickets. It's certainly not getting them on the front page. There's more made around here about a phone call or a text that Joe Flacco hasn't made to the other quarterback than to what Buck's telling the guys and where Machado is going to get dealt ultimately. And for the Orioles, the biggest question now is who's running the place on the baseball side, because there are going to be a lot of things that are going to happen here over the next 60 to 90 days. They're going to draft baseball players next month. They're going to have this trading deadline. And once again, the real problem here is sort of the Willy Wonka in the way they run the place. There is no marketing effort because there's no transparency about how they even operate from a media standpoint and from a business standpoint. Someone needs to stand out on front of this and say, we're here to fix this. We're going to make this better. They're not even giving that message. Instead, the only message they get, which they're comfortable with getting, is Buck goes out there after every game and holds a funeral every night. It's really bizarre, where they are in this thing. And even more bizarre that Peter has no voice in this anymore. So if he has no voice, then what is the voice, right?
Yeah, well, it's increasingly difficult. You mentioned all those different things that occur, all those other sports. Sports and entertainment dollars that people reach into their pocket, their wallet, their debit card for. It's fungible, and that is dollars that would have been spent on the Orioles are now going to be spent someplace else. It's back to this frequency question. People are not going to just continue to spend in the one place. They're going to begin to move that money around, unless they're really, really hardcore baseball fans or they have a company commitment there or something of the sort that they've had season tickets for 20, 30, 40 years, things like that. But the key point is it's so difficult now in consumer marketing because there's so much, right? You've got traditional media you've got social media, you've got digital media, you've got all these other areas, and you really have to telegraph to people what your intentions are, right? Not just the value of coming to the ballpark, that it's low ticket price, it's accessible, it's those kinds of things, but you really have to telegraph your intentions. And again, the number one intention that they have to telegraph is, what's the organization going to become? What's it going to transform into? And who are those people? And I understand that that's difficult from one standpoint, that you have current players like Machado and Adam Jones and other people like that. But you have to begin, like you said earlier, you have to begin to allow information to move into the marketplace. Some people would call it leaks. Some people would call it sources that give people an understanding or an inclination of what might be happening. What's likely to happen? Are we looking at a month? Are we looking at 3 weeks? Are we looking at 5 weeks to start to telegraph that? And you have to do that with people in the marketplace. You just can't constantly rely upon Ken Rosenthal to lead the story so that everybody in Baltimore picks it up. And if they would do things like that, and that has been done in the past, you will see a groundswell of support. Like I said, Baltimore is an incredibly loyal market for its sports organizations. Look at the attendance numbers. They don't drop like they did in Tampa and San Diego and other places like that. It's a real loyal and consistent market for sports here, but they do respond when you telegraph and do the kinds of messaging and consumer messaging that are necessary now for people to respond to and getting it into social media. Frankly, using MASN in a way that should be used. Right now, it's used as an organ, but it's only about a 10 or 15% of what it really could be. Any other organization that would have two channels on somebody's cable bill would be doing a heck of a lot more than what they've been doing over the last decade.
He is Marty Conway, speaking the truth to all the noise here, and a longtime professor at Georgetown. You can follow him out at LinkedIn as well as Twitter. All of our WNST programming brought to you by our friends at Box Hill Pizzeria, where they have those tasty crab cakes up in Abingdon. They are remodeling their showroom up there and the dining space. You'll see it's under construction. Bigger, better. They're moving the patio out a little bit. It's going to be fantastic up there in Abingdon, as the crab cakes are always fantastic. I'm also partial to the Hitos when I'm not getting the crab cake. BoxHillPizzeria.com. You can ship those crab cakes anywhere. Also, Fremont Mortgage. Don't make a 30-year mistake by choosing the wrong lender. You need the right lender. That's Carl Delmont and our friends at Fremont Mortgage, sponsoring all of our Give a Spit swabs in our chats. We've been working through that this summer as well. You can find them at Fremont.com. Buying, selling, or just learning. They're there to help you out. Marty, the 1988 thing came back last week, right? And obviously, the parallels between this team and that team are there from how many are they going to lose? Are they going to lose 100 or are they going to lose 90-something at this point, which is the only question we have, and other questions about Machado and Deals and Brady Anderson. But I watched that 15-minute piece. I lived through that. Clearly, you lived through it on the inside. I was a 20-year-old kid working out at the Evening Sun for Ken Rosenthal. I was his assistant on the desk at night doing the Agate page and all that. I remember the parties we threw when they played in Minnesota and Chicago, trying to win a game when the thing got into the teens. The Capitals were playing playoff hockey, and I told a story about Phil Jackman and I driving down to a Caps game when it was like 0-12 or 0-13. And he's like, yeah, 0-13, it's all cute and clever, and the media's going to chase them around. But then they're going to be 8-36. And then what happens? And, for the 1988 thing and for how fantastic fans happened, and it really has illuminated for anyone old enough like you and I, and maybe even someone young who doesn't remember it at all or doesn't have any association, to how significant that franchise was and how the hearts, the literal love that I had for the Orioles, love that my family had for the Orioles, that does not exist in that way in 2018 anymore. And it's an incredibly romantic story that you were a part of, that you just waxed on about how loyal this community's been and how this community's always been sports-centric and sports-focused. I'm worried about all of that, Marty, because this has been a quarter of a century of Putin running the Orioles here from an informational standpoint, from a who gets the vote, from who gets to play, from everything about the organization. I don't know how they're going to have the light shine back on, or if it will ever happen again, that people are going to feel warm and fuzzy about Brooks and Boog and Cal the way maybe in 1988 they did. Because seeing the video of all that and feeling it, I'm sure it brought back some emotions that you haven't had in a long time, right?
No, I mean, it was right in the eye of the storm, as I said earlier, that, we had these free agents. We had the period from 85 to 87, 88, where we were trying to, Edward Bennett Williams was trying to spend free agent money, which hadn't really been something the team had done. And he was really trying to extend the window, if you recall, from the 83 World Championships, and really trying to extend that window for a few more years. And so, yeah, we had a plan, right? We have a marketing plan to go into the season. You lose the first 5 or 6, you fire the manager, which was incredibly controversial at the time because of the presence of Cal and Billy in the dugout as well. That was very sensitive for a while. And then, but what was happening was, in some respects, losing that first 13, 14, brought some focus to Baltimore, brought a little empathy for the city, for the team, and that's what people responded to. But keep in mind that the context to that entire situation in that time was the question of, would the Orioles even stay in Baltimore? Because at that point, Edward Bennett Williams and others, there was a lot of speculation, although it turned out certainly not to be true, that what his real intent was to use the city for a stalking horse in order to get the baseball in Washington, which is where his law practice was and where he was. There was a lot of cynicism and a lot of skepticism about what actually was going on. So the fact that the amount of people that showed up in that context, it wasn't just because they loved Baltimore and the Orioles. They certainly did, but they were also looking to express very visibly why the team should stay here. But ultimately, that in watching the meter when we decided to do what we were going to do on that Tuesday night, was you saw this thing starting to build, and you're saying to yourself, this game could sell out. This would be a remarkable story unto itself, which is to have 50-some thousand people come out for a team. Now, when people were buying tickets right up until a couple days before, the team had lost all those consecutive games. And then, as you saw in the video, we actually won a game in Chicago, and a lot of people in the office thought, well, that's it. Ticket buying is going to stop because now that the streak is over, there's no reason. Tickets continue to be bought right up until game time. And that was the remarkable thing about it. But
well, you guys had the media on your side. 2-11-13, and Vince Bagley and Chris Thomas, they were all talking it up. The papers were writing about it, and it was an event. It was, hey, come show your love for the team and support these fellas, these guys like Eddie Murray and Cal Ripken that we love here that won a championship. Those guys were part of that team, and Bill Ripken, obviously, with the bat on his head and all that stuff. We felt as though these were family members here because Chuck and Brooks and, they told us, and John Miller, they told us these guys were fans. We had to come out and boost them up. They're part of our fan. Nobody feels that way about Adam Jones or Manny Machado here. All they're interested in is whether you're going to get traded to the Rangers or the Yankees or the Mets, Yeah,
well, also keep in mind at the time, a lot of those tickets, many thousands of those tickets were bought by small businesses and medium to large businesses who would buy 200, 300, 500. One organization bought 1,000 tickets for their employees and wanted to get everybody out. There was a real sense through that. We had the designated hitters group. We had a number of other organizations. There was a real sense that this organization belonged, as Edward Bennett Williams would often say, it was like a public trust. He owned the team, but he was essentially just holding it for the community. And that's one of the gaps that's missing. A lot has changed in Baltimore in those 30 years, and the relationship between the club and the small business and medium to large business community has just changed. There's still some there, but it's very transactional. And the reason why I can say that is, you look around the community, you don't see very many Oriole promotions going on at retail, right? There's some things that happen at the ballpark. There's some giveaways and things like that. But you don't see retail organizations, the oil and gas companies like Crown, other people like that, who are constantly having an Oriole presence at their retail
Marty,
level.
I have a literal sponsor, and you can do the math on this, and I'm not going to out them, that got a letter, a cease and desist letter, telling them to take the Oriole logo off the wall. a number of years ago, got a legal letter from Angelos saying you can't. Literally, there was a sports bar, Hispanic sports bar, across the street from Sarasota. When I went down there 10 years ago to do radio from the bar, maybe 8 years ago, whenever they got to Sarasota, I was going to go down there and broadcast from across the street, because they won't let me in, and I want to go down and support because I am a Civic member and a Baltimore guy and a sports guy. And the sports bar owner said, We tried to welcome the Orioles, and we welcome the Orioles on. Their people came over and told us to take Orioles down off the signs because that's their logo. So we won't welcome the Orioles here. He said the White Sox didn't behave like that, and I'm like, well, literally they were telling people to take Orioles off the wall. So that's how bizarre this is. From you were trying to get anyone to do anything to buy some Orioles tickets and to feel vested. This franchise for a quarter of a century has not behaved that way.
Yeah, well, that is part of it. If somebody wants to participate, one of the things you do is, you certainly, I wouldn't recommend, that would not be my choice to do it that way. Rather, instead of send a letter, I'd send a person, and I'd say, how would you like to do business with us? What can we do together to do that ultimately? But I understand, that's different. I don't know the other facts of that different scenario, but instead of sending a letter, I always would say send a person, right? It'd be better to have somebody walk in than getting a letter in the mail. But as I said, that's kind of the subtext of what I think the way that the situation as it currently sits, and, how do you rectify that? Well, you're going to have to do many, many things to do it. They've done some things like that in the past, but nothing has ever really stuck because ultimately it requires somebody or literally several people who are truly vested and have a high enough level and high enough profile in the marketplace and in the city that they can go from, like I said, boardroom to small business to pizza place, whatever, and actually visibly represent the organization and extend a hand. And then you can talk about what are some of the other things that can be done in return. Because, again, the business marketplace is different. If you're out there spending money, one of the places you're thinking about is social and digital media and other places that are giving you an immediate return, on your investment. And that's one of the challenges for sport organizations today is the price of all these things in stadium and arenas has gotten so expensive that it's very difficult now for some of these organizations to actually see a clear return on that investment. So then it becomes sort of a write-off as a civic investment. And you only have a certain amount of budget for that. Not everybody has the budget for just kind of a civic investment. The largest companies do, but many of the medium and small businesses don't have that. They need their relationship to have a visible return, as you know, because you're in that business yourself.
Marty Conway is here. You can find him on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Anything you want to say about the Caps or anything else that's going on? Obviously we got lacrosse being played right now. The Ravens have become relevant. Even the Redskins are relevant through their cheerleader thing, and we can get to that another day as well. But the Capitals should be growing right now. I see it on my timeline. The people that hate the Capitals and PP on the Capitals for 30 years, even they're going to buy in here over the next week or two. The Capitals have not only an opportunity to win a Stanley Cup and do something cool, but at least right here, right now, they're promised these couple of games this week and to keep the conversation moving forward and the thought about winning a championship. This is probably as good as it gets for the Capitals over 46 years of playing hockey, right? Like, this is only the second best that they've been. Well, they've done this the third time they've been to the conference finals in 45 years. This is where you have to grow your brand, right?
Yeah, and for the Capitals, one of the reasons why it does get so good at this point is they've come through Pittsburgh, right? And that's like the Ravens, coming through the Steelers. So that adds. It's one thing if they would have beat the Rangers or the Islanders or whoever, but to come through Pittsburgh now is kind of a seminal moment and a breakthrough.
It buys them credibility, right? You beat the Penguins, now you can win, right?
Absolutely.
Exactly, right.
Yeah, that you've put that curse sort of behind you. But for hockey and the Capitals in particular, one of the reasons why you see it the way you do is, think about it now. It's one of, frankly, the smaller arenas for live event, right? You're talking about 18,000, something like that. Nats Park is 40, the Camden Yards 40, M&T, all those other places. So you have a relatively speaking limited amount of people that can get into the event. And so as a result, what you're seeing is that groundswell around it of people who want to stay connected, but literally can't get to the games. And so that's why you see the stoking of social, digital, all these kind of things that come up all the way through Baltimore, surrounding counties. A lot of people want to stay connected to it because ultimately NHL hockey tickets in postseason can be very difficult to get because of, like I said, 18,000 seats. You've got season ticket holders holding somewhere between maybe 2 and 4 seats. You don't have that many accounts that actually own access to the tickets. And so that has a spillover effect of people that would like to be involved but can't, and so they figure out some other way to support that versus having 40,000 seats, having 70,000 seats where, many people can get involved. I do think, just to flip the script for a second to the Ravens, that what you saw through the draft process was an acknowledgement from Steve Bisciotti on down that they needed to do something for the business and betterment of the franchise. I think the jury's going to be out for a long time as to whether their quarterback that they selected will be the quarterback of the future. But at the moment, in the now moment, I think that they sensed, rightly so, that there was an incredible amount of apathy with respect to the organization, including players on the field and some things. And so just even stepping up, moving up into the end of the first round to draft Lamar Jackson was sort of a symbolic move. They might have been able to make a move at the beginning of the second round and perhaps still get him. But moving up into the first round really got people's attention. And if they were, at 5 or 6% away from getting to their season ticket goal, I think that was an indication that maybe they moved 2 or 3 or 4 points in the season ticket process of moving people from being on the fence before the draft to committing to their season tickets for next year and deciding not to put their PSLs on the market. Ultimately, we don't know whether it's going to be, whether it's going to really work out. But I think it was Steve Bisciotti putting his thumb on the scale of, hey guys, this organization needs something now, and if it's possible, let's find a way to do that. We'll deal with the implications for it down the road. But I think that was very clear, because otherwise, why would you move up to the end of the first round necessarily to get him, to get Lamar Jackson? So I tip my hat to them, because I think they had a clear sense, put their thumb in the wind of what the marketplace was here for tickets in Baltimore, and they were saying, let's figure out a way to do something, and they may have come onto it. We'll see.
We'll see how that translates down onto the field. Marty, anytime you want to come to an Orioles game, buddy, we have plenty of good seats available. I hear they're on Groupon for $6, but I only hear that on the. I'm hearing things. Marty, always pleasure, man. I knew you'd have some insights on that. And I really did think of you a lot last week on the Fantastic Fans thing as that story got stirred up, because I know you were in the middle of that, and I guess you look back 30 years. It's a great story now, but when you were in the middle of it, it was not where you want to be at 0-21 and having to go face business clients and people you're trying to sell sponsorships to, right?
No, it wasn't. But I'll tell you just the one personal anecdote that I'll always remember, and that was actually the last day that I ever saw Ed Williams alive, and he was in the conference room at Memorial Stadium while this scurrying was going on or about. And one time I was just busting in and out, and the conference room door was open. I was going by, and he flagged me down and wanted to ask me a question about something. And it was just that last moment where I'll never forget, saying, literally, because that was May and he passed away in August and he was never able to get back up to the ballpark. But at that point, again, that was somebody who was selfless in this regard. He could have very easily and probably more profitably made that deal in Washington. There were many places he could have moved the stadium to and done that. He certainly had no longer an obligation to Baltimore. He was on a year-to-year contract. But he made a handshake deal that ultimately, with Governor Schaefer, that turned into the memorandum of understanding that they signed that night on the train. Larry Lucchino and Herb Belgrad signed on the train coming up to Baltimore. And that really solidified the team probably now for another 50 or 100 years or whatever it's going to be. So my one personal takeaway was that's the last night that I was ever actually to see and speak to Ed Williams. And I think he, still to this day, probably doesn't get his full due for solidifying the Orioles franchise here in Baltimore for the next century.
Yeah, there's never been a conversation to have with you or Larry or anybody in any of those seats, Charlie Steinberg, that that wouldn't indicate that. I don't know why Legend didn't write it that way, right? Like, Angelos came into the 90s so swashbuckling, and no one stood up for EBW. He was long gone, right? Jacobs came in and kind of screwed it up and ran guys like you off and other people, during that period of time. And then everything changed when Peter came in. That's so long forgotten, because Peter's epitaph, and his family's going to try to write this, is that he saved the franchise, which is disgraceful. You know what I mean? Like, it's not even remotely factual. And EBW, because the story hasn't been written like that for 30 years by the people like you that were inside of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ed there's a little area outside the ballpark that is the EBW Plaza part of it. But you're absolutely right that once the lease was in place, once that memorandum of understanding was in place in May of 1988, that ultimately led to the lease for Camden Yards, that solidified the franchise. There might have been other people who bought the franchise who might have lived out of state or out of the city part-time or whatever that circumstance was, but the franchise wasn't going anyplace. It might have been owned by some different people, but the franchise was solidified once that 30-year lease was in place, knowing that you were going to probably get at least one more 20 or 30-year lease out of that. The ballpark useful life was going to be 50 or 60 years at least. And so that was the move to solidify the franchise in Baltimore forever and ever. The ownership is going to come and go, but ultimately, anchoring that deal with the state and with the city is really what did. And also, quite frankly, right, brought football to the market as well, because when that deal was done for baseball, at the same time, the legislature funded the football stadium at the same time, which allowed the opportunity to bring the Browns here. So in a lot of ways, that statement, that what Ed Williams did, not only for the Orioles but for football, sort of memorializes, if you will, the entire landscape of Baltimore sports for the next 50 or 100 years, at least in my view, anyhow. And that's the way I saw it.
Well, you've taught me something new again, so I'm glad I had you on. I mean, I always bring up Governor Schaefer, I probably should cede that back to EBW, and I'll start to do that in the future as I write the history of Baltimore sports, because nobody else is going to do it. Marty, take care of yourself, man. I always appreciate your time, and at some point, maybe you and I will get together for a little hockey game or baseball game here this spring and summer. I'd like that.
Love to. We'll do that.
Rocking and rolling, Marty Conway, the man, the myth, the legend, Georgetown professor and longtime Orioles as well as Texas Rangers front office executive. Follow him out on LinkedIn as well as on Twitter, where he's been chippy lately at Marty Conway. You can find me out in the buy at Toyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere you happen to be. Our morning newspaper ships digitally at 7 a.m. to your email inbox each and every morning. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get yourself in the best shape. I mean, we got some good weather last week. Get yourself a gym membership. Get it at Planet Fitness. It's right around the corner. It's only going to set you back $10 a month. No commitment there, just like the commercial says. Check them out. PlanetofTriumphs.com if you need some inspiration as well. Maryland Jockey Club also puts its entries for Pimlico this week in the front of WNST.net as well as in our morning newspaper. You can subscribe to our morning newspaper out on the front of our website. It's pretty good. Also, our text service is pretty kick-ass as well with breaking news. And at some point, they'll deal Manny Machado, we think, this summer. Whenever that magic moment happens, it'll happen first on the WNST text service. All brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Reminder, Dennis is doing Friday this week, not Thursday, 3 until 5. It is the SSV on WNST. Reminder to get out to Royal Farms real fresh, real fast. Get yourself some Kona Blend. I got to try that dark Brazilian roast. I haven't done that yet, but I'm down with that. I'll do that in my Cole Roofing mug here on the webcam we have here for YouTube and our WNS TV channel. Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast. The Rofo Arena, also the host for the Baltimore Brigade. Their next home game is May 25 against the Philadelphia Soul. That's Friday night. All right, we got Preakness coming up next week. We got the Caps going into the Stanley Cup semifinals or the Eastern Conference Finals, and the Orioles home all week. Luke's on that. And, of course, the eternal Joe Flacco, Lamar Jackson debate rages on. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.